You've probably been taught to think that social change happens because people finally listen, that if enough suffering is visible, if enough facts are presented, if enough voices speak at once, power eventually responds. And when it doesn't, the explanation is usually personal. People weren't patient enough, polite enough, unified enough, or strategic in the right way. But that story leaves out something important. For most of U.S. history, workers were already suffering, and power still ignored them. Before the New Deal, working conditions were brutal and widely known. Long hours, dangerous factories, poverty wages, child labor, no safety nets, none of this was hidden. Workers petitioned, they appealed to lawmakers, they tried to negotiate, they organized respectfully. And the response was predictable: firings, blacklists, police violence, and in many cases, military force. What changed things wasn't better arguments. It was when production stopped, when factories froze, when transportation stalled, when profits collapsed. Power didn't respond to awareness. It responded to disruption it couldn't absorb. This is the part history often smooths over. What worked wasn't morality. What worked wasn't being right. What worked was coordinated pressure that made daily operations impossible. And what didn't work was restraint offered to a system that had no incentive to reciprocate it. That doesn't mean chaos. It means leverage. When people confuse visibility with power, they exhaust themselves trying to be heard. When they understand leverage, they force a response. So the real lesson here isn't about labor nostalgia, it's about clarity. Change didn't come because leaders suddenly cared. It came because ignoring people became more dangerous than conceding to them. That distinction matters because it explains why some movements win, why others stall, and why policy so often arrives dressed up as generosity after pressure peaks. Understanding that difference is where real movement literacy begins. People often look back at moments of change and assume something softened, that leaders finally understood, that compassion kicked in, that the right arguments reached the right ears. But if you stay with the labor struggles before the New Deal, a different pattern shows up. Concessions didn't come when elites were persuaded. They came when elites were afraid. When strikes spread across industries, the fear wasn't moral, it was operational. Factories sat idle, supply chains broke, cities slowed, profits fell, investors panicked, and instability started leaking into places power actually cares about. That's when the tone shifted, not because conditions suddenly looked unjust, they already were, but because unrest threatened to spiral beyond control. Elites didn't ask, how do we help? They asked, how do we stabilize this before it spreads? That's the moment concessions enter the picture. This is where history often gets rewritten. What begins as containment later gets remembered as generosity. What starts as fear becomes framed as leadership. What's forced under pressure gets retold as vision. But policy concessions are not gifts. So they are pressure valves. They exist to restore order, to protect the system, and to make disruptions stop. Understanding this doesn't make movements cynical, it makes them accurate. If you believe change comes from being convincing, you'll keep trying to win hearts that don't control outcomes. If you understand that change comes from altering risk, you stop asking whether power agrees with you and start paying attention to what power can't tolerate. That shift from persuasion to leverage is what separates movements that get absorbed from movements that force change. Once you see that concessions come from fear, another question shows up underneath it. If pressure works, why doesn't it last? Why do gains stall, shrink, or disappear once the immediate crisis passes? In the years leading up to the New Deal, unrest didn't just force concessions, it scared the entire political and economic order. But fear is temporary, stability is the goal. Once strikes slowed and workplaces reopened, the urgency shifted. Power moved to contain, manage, and redirect what it had just been forced to concede. Some demands were absorbed, others were delayed, many were redesigned to limit how far they could go. This wasn't betrayal, it was strategy. The system didn't change because it was convinced. It adjusted because it needed to survive. This is where a lot of people misread history. They see partial wins and assume the work is done. They see policy on paper and mistake it for power in practice. They confuse relief with transformation. But concessions are not endpoints. They're compromises under pressure, and when pressure fades, so does enforcement, expansion, and protection. That's not a failure of the movement, it's a predictable response from power. This matters because it explains a pattern people keep blaming themselves for. Why things improve briefly, then erode. Why rights exist in theory, but not always in daily life. Why progress feels reversible. Without sustained structure, pressure collapses back into normalcy. And normalcy is where systems quietly rebuild themselves. That's why understanding how pressure works is only the beginning. What matters just as much is what happens after power bends, and what movements need if they don't want to start from scratch every generation. By the time the New Deal arrived, the country was already on edge. That part usually gets skipped. We're taught to picture a calm hand steering the nation out of crisis, a president with vision, a government finally doing the right thing. But what actually existed first was chaos, hunger, mass unemployment, strikes spreading faster than they could be contained, veterans marching on Washington, factories being seized by workers who refused to leave. The New Deal did not calm a stable nation. It responded to one that was becoming ungovernable. Organizers didn't win the New Deal by asking for it. They made the cost of doing nothing unbearable. Millions of people were out of work. Banks were collapsing. Labor actions shut down entire industries. Farmers destroyed crops rather than sell at a loss. Tenants resisted eviction en masse. What terrified elites wasn't poverty. They had lived with poverty before. What terrified them was coordination. The sense that unrest was no longer isolated, that people were learning from each other, that refusal was spreading. That's when policy moved. Not to end capitalism, but to stabilize it. Not to empower workers indefinitely, but to lower the temperature before something worse took hold. This is the part that gets softened in hindsight. The New Deal wasn't a moral awakening, it was a containment strategy. Social security, labor protections, public jobs programs, these weren't gifts, they were pressure responses designed to restore order and preserve the broader system by making life barely livable again. That doesn't make them meaningless, it makes them legible. They show what power does when pushed far enough, and how far it's willing to go to protect itself. This matters because it corrects a dangerous misunderstanding. If you think the New Deal happened because leaders were generous, you'll wait for generosity again. If you understand it happened because instability threatened control, you stop waiting to be saved and start paying attention to leverage. The lesson isn't that reform is impossible. It's that reform follows pressure and only lasts as long as pressure has somewhere to live. That's the difference between a moment and a movement. After the New Deal, something strange happened. The policies remained, but the movements that forced them forward slowly faded from the story. What stayed in public memory were leaders, speeches, and laws. What disappeared were the strikes, the shutdowns, the coordination, and the people who made the country unmanageable long enough to force change. This wasn't an accident. When radical movements win material concessions, they become dangerous in a new way, not because they are violent, but because they prove something the system depends on people not learning, that pressure works. So history gets edited. Disruption is reframed as disorder. Organizers are labeled extremists. Collective action is remembered as chaos that had to be controlled. And the policies that followed are retold as the result of wisdom and leadership. The lesson people are left with is backwards. They're taught to admire the outcome while forgetting the methods that made it unavoidable. Erasure is not just about the past, it's about preventing replication. If people remember how change actually happened, they might try it again. If they forget, they're more likely to believe progress comes from patience, civility, and waiting for the right leaders to appear. This is how movements get isolated across generations. Each one is told it's unprecedented. Each one is made to feel unrealistic. Each one is denied a usable lineage. That disconnection is a form of control. Understanding erasure isn't about nostalgia, it's about orientation. When today's struggles feel fragmented or ineffective, it's not because people have lost courage. It's because memory has been deliberately broken. Reclaiming that memory doesn't mean copying the past. It means refusing to let power hide the mechanics of change. Because once people understand that wins are erased on purpose, they stop mistaking invisibility for failure and start asking what needs to be built so pressure doesn't disappear again. By the time repression becomes the headline, something else has usually already gone wrong. That's another part history flattens. We're taught to believe movements failed because the state crushed them. Surveillance, infiltration, raids, assassinations, and all of that is real. But it's not the whole story. Long before repression finished movements off, many were already stretched thin. People were exhausted, burned out, living under constant threat with no place to rest or regroup. Leadership narrowed. A few figures carried too much responsibility. Too many decisions flowed through too few bodies. Groups stayed isolated. Organizations didn't share resources. Local wins didn't translate into durable national structure. And there were very few containers built to hold people long term. No systems for care, no redundancy, no way to survive pressure without collapsing inward. Repression didn't create those weaknesses, it exploited them. This matters because blaming everything on outside enemies feels safer than telling the full truth. If movements only fail because they're attacked, then there's nothing to learn, nothing to adjust, nothing to build differently. But if movements also struggle because they lack structure that can carry scale, then survival becomes a design question, not a moral one. Burnout isn't a personal flaw. Isolation isn't accidental. Leader dependency isn't inevitable. They are outcomes of how movements are built. Seeing this clearly changes the task. The goal isn't just to resist repression, it's to outgrow it. That means building forms of organizing that don't collapse when pressure hits, structures that distribute leadership instead of concentrating it, containers that let people stay involved without being consumed. Because power doesn't just attack movements from the outside, it waits for them to weaken from within. And the next phase of this history isn't about who was right or wrong. It's about what had to exist for pressure to last, and what has to be built differently now. After the New Deal, many people were told the same quiet story, that the system had been fixed, that the crisis had passed, that the worst was over. So when protections weakened decades later, it was framed as failure, bad management, economic necessity, an unfortunate shift. But what happened wasn't neglect, it was reversal. The welfare state didn't slowly fade on its own, it was deliberately dismantled. Once labor unrest declined and pressure dispersed, elites regained room to maneuver. Programs were underfunded, eligibility was narrowed, unions were weakened, public goods were reframed as inefficiencies. Private markets were presented as solutions. None of this required mass approval. It only required the absence of sustained disruption. The same system that conceded under pressure retracted those concessions once stability returned. This wasn't punishment, it was correction. Here's the mistake people are encouraged to make. They see protections disappear and assume they failed, that the ideas were flawed, that people asked for too much, that change went too far, but gains didn't collapse because they were unworkable. They collapsed because they were no longer defended. Relief without organized defense is temporary. Policy without pressure is conditional. What looks like decay is often strategy working as intended. This matters because it reframes how people understand loss. When benefits shrink, when safeguards erode, when precarity returns, it's not proof that organizing was pointless. It's proof that pressure was the only thing holding the line. And it answers a critical question before moving forward. Why building power isn't just about winning demands, but about creating structures that can protect those wins once the crisis passes. Without that, every generation is forced to fight the same battles again, believing they're starting from nothing, when in reality, they're inheriting something that was deliberately taken apart. For a long time, movements were taught to explain collapse through a single loss: a leader assassinated, a voice silenced, a figure removed. It makes the story easier to tell, cleaner, more tragic, and it hides something dangerous. When movements are built around singular figures, power doesn't have to defeat everyone. It only has to remove a few. Decapitation works when leadership is concentrated, when knowledge isn't shared, when decisions flow upward instead of outward, when people are mobilized but not organized. This is why charismatic leadership gets rewarded by the system even as it's threatened by it. It personalizes struggle, it narrows responsibility, it creates movements that can be disrupted by targeting individuals instead of confronting structures. The problem was never leadership itself, it was dependency. The myth says movements need heroes. History says movements need infrastructure. When people are taught to wait for the right voice, they delay their own participation. When leadership is treated as rare, capacity stays scarce. When visibility replaces coordination, power learns exactly where to strike. This isn't about blaming leaders, it's about refusing to confuse inspiration with durability. Representation can open doors. It cannot hold them open alone. Understanding this changes what people build next. The goal stops being finding the right person and starts becoming building systems that don't collapse when someone leaves. Shared skills, distributed decision-making, redundant leadership, clear roles that don't require charisma to function. Because movements that rely on stars burn bright and burn out. Movements that rely on structure are harder to silence, harder to erase, and much harder to dismantle. And that distinction will matter deeply once the focus shifts from what failed to what has to be built to last. Mutual aid is often where people turn when the system fails them. Food, childcare, medical rides, rent support. Community care that shows up faster than any institution ever has. And for many people, especially those pushed to the margins, mutual aid isn't theory, it's survival. But survival and power are not the same thing. Historically, mutual aid has always grown under pressure, when wages were unlivable, when the state withdrew, when communities were left to fend for themselves. People filled the gaps because they had to, and those networks saved lives. But on their own, they rarely forced structural change. Why? Because meeting needs can stabilize a crisis without changing the conditions that caused it. Power is often perfectly comfortable letting communities take care of each other as long as nothing disrupts profit, policy, or control. Mutual aid reduces harm. Power building changes terms. This is where a lot of movements quietly stall. Care work becomes the whole movement. Energy goes into constant response. People stay busy, needed, exhausted, and the system stays intact. That doesn't make mutual aid a mistake. It makes it incomplete. When care isn't paired with organized pressure, it becomes a buffer that absorbs suffering instead of a force that prevents it. The system offloads responsibility downward while maintaining authority upward. The lesson isn't to abandon care, it's to connect it to leverage. Mutual aid keeps people alive. Power building changes what people have to survive. When those two are separated, movements burn out, trying to hold back collapse with their bodies. When they're aligned, care becomes a base, not a substitute. Understanding that difference matters because the next question isn't whether people care enough, and it's whether care is being used to manage crisis or to end the conditions creating it. At a certain point, something else starts happening. Not repression, not rollback, absorption. Movements don't always get crushed. Sometimes they get invited inside. Capitalism is extremely good at surviving threats. When disruption grows, it looks for ways to neutralize it without force. Funding replaces organizing. Nonprofits replace mass participation. Language replaces leverage. Movements get reframed as causes. Leaders become professionals. Demands turn into grant proposals. Urgency turns into branding. Nothing is banned. Everything is permitted, as long as it no longer interferes with accumulation, control, or profit. Resistance doesn't disappear. It gets managed. This is why so many people feel like they're doing everything and nothing is changing. They're visible, they're educated, they're invited into conversations, they're celebrated symbolically, but the conditions stay the same. Capitalism doesn't need to defeat movements outright. It just needs to redirect them away from pressure and toward expression. Expression feels active, but it doesn't threaten power. This is how movements become legible but harmless, present but contained. Understanding this isn't about rejecting every institution or resource. It's about recognizing the difference between access and power. When movements trade disruption for inclusion, they gain recognition and lose leverage. When they accept management instead of confrontation, they stay busy without changing outcomes. If power adapts, it absorbs what it can't immediately suppress, and it waits, which means the real question moving forward isn't, are we allowed to do this, or will we be taken seriously? It's whether what's being built can still interrupt the system once the invitations start coming. If this reframed how you think about change, pause here with it. Let it settle. And if you want to keep building this understanding together, subscribe and tap the bell so you don't miss what comes next. New videos in this series drop Sundays at noon and Wednesdays at 6:30 p.m. We're here for durable change that avoids burnout.